Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something, well, fascinating, maybe a bit unsettling too. It's about edible seaweed. You know, that food many of us think is super healthy.
Right, a staple for many.
Well, there's this recent study focusing on microplastic contamination, specifically in packaged seaweeds from ethnic food stores in Mexico City.
Exactly. And our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack the key findings from this paper. We want to understand, how much microplastic is actually in these seaweeds.
And what does it mean for us?
Yeah, what it could mean for you, the consumer. The study looks specifically at the dried, seasoned, and roasted types, the kind you typically buy in those ethnic or specialty stores right there in Mexico City.
Okay, seaweed and microplastics, it sounds a bit unexpected, doesn't it?
It does initially.
But to really get why this study is important, we probably need to zoom out a bit first. Talk about the bigger picture of plastic pollution.
Absolutely. It's staggering, really. Globally, we're churning out something like 300 million tons of plastic waste every year.
300 million tons.
Yeah, and a huge chunk of that, estimates are between 4.8 and maybe 12.7 million tons, ends up in the oceans annually.
Wow.
And Mexico itself contributes, a significant amount too, maybe 0.01 to 0.25 million metric tons to that ocean plastic problem.
And that plastic doesn't just disappear, right? It breaks down. That's where microplastics come in.
Precisely. These are tiny plastic bits defined as being between 1 micrometer, which is incredibly small, up to 5 millimeters.
Mm-hmm.
They mostly come from larger plastics breaking down from sunlight, waves, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But some are actually made small, like those microbeads you used to find in, like, face scrubs.
Right, I remember those. So these tiny pieces, how do they spread so widely?
Well, they're basically everywhere. They've been found in surface water, deep ocean sediments, even floating in the air.
In the air?
Yes. And because they're so small and persistent, they get eaten by marine life, birds, all sorts of creatures. They get into the food chain.
That sounds not good. What happens when animals ingest them?
Well, research suggests it's not great. The plastics can build up in their tissues. This might lead to them eating less, having lower energy reserves, messing with their immune systems.
Okay.
And there's even some concern about neurotoxic effects.
And I heard they can carry other things too, like pollutants.
That's a really important point. They can act like little sponges, absorbing chemical pollutants from the water. And microbes can grow on them too, forming biofilms. This could potentially help spread pathogens or even antibiotic resistance genes.
So it's the plastic and what it carries. Okay, let's bring it back to people. To human exposure, how are we encountering these microplastics?
Yeah, it seems our diet is a major pathway. More and more evidence points to food consumption as a key route for, long-term exposure.
Makes sense. Food packaging, the environment.
Exactly. And they have been found in quite a few things we consume regularly. Drinking water, beer, salt, sugar, milk. The list is growing.
That's quite the list. Do we know how much we might actually be eating?
There are estimates. Some studies predict a weekly intake anywhere from, say, 0.1 grams up to maybe 5 grams or so.
That sounds like a credit card's worth over time, maybe? I've heard that comparison.
Something like that, potentially. And maybe more directly, microplastics have actually been found in human samples.
Like where?
In blood, lung tissue, liver tissue, the placenta.
Yeah.
And yes, in feces too.
Wow. That really drives it home. So what are the potential health impacts for us? What's the concern?
The science is still developing, but there are concerns that chronic exposure might contribute to things like oxidative stress, inflammation, possibly metabolic issues, maybe even reproductive effects. But, and this is important, we still have a lot to learn about the long-term effects of dietary microplastic exposure. There are definite knowledge gaps.
Understood. So a known environmental issue, potential health concerns, diet is a key pathway. Now back to the seaweed in this deep dive. Why focus on seaweed specifically?
Well, seaweed's incredibly popular, especially in Asia, Japan, Korea, China, Vietnam, and so on. And it's known for being really nutritious. Full of protein, omega-3s, minerals, polyphenols. Good stuff.
Right. It's seen as a health food.
Exactly. It has known health benefits used in functional foods, and its popularity is growing globally.
Not just in Asia anymore.
No, especially among vegans and vegetarians looking for nutrient-dense options. And because of this demand, you see more ethnic food stores popping up everywhere. The global market for commercial seaweed is pretty big, close to $10 billion a few years back, and expected to grow.
Big business and healthy eating. So why Mexico City? Why look at ethnic stores there for this study?
Good question. The researchers pointed out that while we know microplastics are a general issue, There actually hasn't been much research specifically on the seaweed sold commercially in stores, especially ethnic stores. There were a few studies in Asia, but this specific angle, looking at imports in a place like Mexico City, was relatively unexplored. Plus, there was already evidence emerging of microplastic contamination in Mexico City itself, in the air, water, some foods. So it made sense to see if seaweed was another exposure route for people there.
Got it. So what were they hoping to find out? What were the main goals?
They had a few key objectives. First, just see if microplastics were present in these seaweed products. Second, characterize them: what shape, size, color, what kind of plastic. Third, compare levels. Did it matter where the seaweed came from, or if it was dried versus roasted? And finally, try to estimate human exposure, both for the Asian communities who eat a lot of seaweed and the general population.
Okay, clear goals. How did they do it? What seaweeds did they actually test?
They went out and bought 16 different seaweed products from ethnic stores in Mexico City. This was back in early 2023. They got a mixed dried, seasoned, and roasted types, different brands. And the seaweeds themselves originated from China, Korea, Mexico, and the U.S. A good range.
And finding tiny bits of plastic in seaweed. That sounds tricky. How did they analyze the samples?
Yeah, it's quite a meticulous process. They basically use chemicals, hydrogen peroxide, to digest the seaweed material itself, sort of dissolve it away.
Okay.
Then they used a dense liquid, zinc chloride, to separate the lighter plastic particles from the heavier leftover bits. Density separation.
Right.
After that, it was microscope work, counting the particles, noting their shape, size, color. And finally, they used a special technique, FTIR spectroscopy, to figure out the actual type of plastic for a subset of the particles.
FTIR. Okay.
And crucially, they took a lot of precautions to avoid contaminating the samples themselves during the lab work. Quality control was key.
Makes sense. So the big reveal, what were the main findings? What did they discover?
The headline finding: they found microplastics in every single one of the 16 samples.
Every single one. Wow.
Yep. The average amount was around 24 microplastic items per gram of seaweed. But the range was pretty wide. Some went up to 64 items per gram.
This seems like quite a bit.
It does. They also found most were fibers, about 61%. And most were non-colored, about 57%. Size-wise, a lot were small. 60% were under 0.2 millimeters.
Tiny.
Very small. The plastic types included things like polyethylene, polypropylene, polymers, that's nylon, cellophane, rayon, and PETs, like from bottles.
A real mix.
Yeah, suggesting different sources. Interestingly, despite finding plastics everywhere, they used a pollution load index. And overall, it suggested minimal contamination based on their scale.
Okay. How does that square with finding them in every sample?
It's a bit counterintuitive. But what they also highlighted was that the actual number of microplastics per gram they found was generally higher than what previous studies in Asia had reported for seaweed there.
Higher in these Mexico City samples than in Asia. That is surprising. Any ideas why?
They discussed several possibilities. Contamination could happen right where the seaweed grows, from general pollution, or during processing, washing, drying, even atmospheric dust settling on it.
Airborne plastic.
Yeah, atmospheric deposition. Then there's handling, packaging, transport, storage in the store. Lots of potential points. They figured the differences probably came down to variations in processing methods between regions and maybe different environmental pollution levels where it originated.
And maybe the export process itself adds contamination. Longer shipping, different handling.
That's a really interesting thought they raised too. It could be a factor, especially for those higher levels seen in exported products compared to domestic ones in some earlier studies.
Okay, so did the levels differ much depending on where the seaweed came from, or the type: dried, roasted, seasoned?
Yes, significant differences there too. Based on origin, the U.S.-sourced seaweeds had the highest average microplastic count in this study.
Really? The U.S. ones?
Followed by China, then Mexico, and then South Korea had the lowest average.
Interesting.
And like we touched on, the levels in these imported products seemed higher than what previous studies found in similar products within those origin countries.
Okay, what about by type? Roasted versus dried versus seasoned?
Roasted seaweed came out on top with the highest average microplastic content, then dried, and then seasoned had the lowest average. And this was actually the first time roasted and seasoned seaweeds were specifically analyzed for microplastics.
So new data there.
Right. And again, the average concentrations they found overall were generally higher than what earlier studies reported for just dried or raw seaweed.
Does the roasting process somehow concentrate them, or maybe add more through handling?
That's a great question the study raises. It could be concentration or related to the extra processing and handling involved before or after roasting. We don't know for sure yet.
So a U.S. origin roasted seaweed bought in Mexico City had the highest average here. Specific but interesting. What about the characteristics, shape, color, size?
As we mentioned, fibers dominated 60%. Fragments were next at 33%. Spheres and films were much less common.
Fibers, like from clothing or rope.
Potentially, yeah. Most particles were non-colored, 57%, but they did find blue, red, gray, black ones too. Size-wise, the majority, 43%, were smaller than 0.1 millimeter, really tiny.
Teeny tiny.
And they saw a pattern. The smaller the size category, the more particles they found. Only a few percent were bigger than 0.5 millimeter or 1 millimeter. And the mix of plastic types, PET, nylon, rayon, etc., again points towards multiple contamination sources, not just one single culprit.
Right. The study mentioned these indices, MPCF and MPLI. Can you break those down?
Sure. MPCF is the microplastic contamination factor. It basically scores each individual sample based on how contaminated it is compared to a baseline. And based on this MPCF, quite a few samples in the study were classed as significantly contaminated, about 44%, or even extremely contaminated, around 31%.
So individual samples showed high levels.
Exactly. Then there's the MPLI, the pollution load index, that gives a kind of overall pollution score for all the samples combined. The overall MPLI was 4.5, which, according to their classification, indicates minimal contamination across the board.
Okay, so minimal overall, but with some real hot spots in individual products.
That's a good way to put it. The MPCF shows the variation, while the MPLI gives the average picture. Got it. Now, the bottom line for many listening, human exposure. What did this study estimate?
Okay, so based on their findings and typical seaweed consumption patterns for South Korean and Chinese populations in Mexico City, they estimated a yearly intake of about 58,000 microplastic particles just from seaweed.
58,000 from seaweed alone.
That was their estimate for those specific groups. And interestingly, that's higher than previous estimates made for people actually in Korea eating seaweed.
Higher exposure estimate for the diaspora community.
Potentially, based on these findings. For the general Mexico City population, maybe eating just a 5-gram serving occasionally, the estimate was lower, between 70 and 160 particles per serving.
Yeah, still, it adds up.
It absolutely adds up. They also noted that based on their results, people eating the seaweed products sourced from China and the U.S. in this study would likely have higher exposure. And we have to remember, this is on top of microplastics we get from drinking water, other seafood, salt, you name it.
Right, it's cumulative.
Exactly. And again, linking back to those potential long-term health concerns we discussed earlier. These numbers really are sobering. Did this study offer any solutions, any ways to reduce this contamination?
They did touch on potential mitigation. They noted that thorough washing during industrial processing has been shown in other studies to help reduce microplastic loads on seaweed.
So washing helps.
It seems so. They also emphasized the need for tight controls during manufacturing and packaging, trying to prevent contamination from things like airborne dust or handling. And finally, they suggested that regular monitoring of these commercial seaweed products is needed to keep track of the problem and see if interventions are working.
Okay, so let's wrap up this deep dive. Key takeaway seems to be microplastics are definitely in commercially sold seaweed in Mexico City, often at levels higher than reported elsewhere.
Yes, that's the core finding. And this has potential consequences for consumer exposure, especially for ethnic communities who might eat these foods more frequently.
For me, the real aha moment, as you said, is finding this in seaweed, a food we perceive as so natural and healthy.
Exactly. It just underscores how widespread this plastic issue is. It permeates everything, even things from the ocean we think are pristine.
And if you're listening and feeling maybe a bit concerned or overwhelmed by all this,
Which is understandable.
remember that understanding the sources, like this study tries to do, and thinking about potential fixes like better washing or packaging, that's the first step towards tackling it.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with a really important question to ponder, doesn't it? This study found lots of particles smaller than 0.2 millimeters. We know from other research that particles smaller than maybe 150 micrometers might be able to cross from our gut into our body tissues.
Right, that potential for translocation.
Exactly. So the question is, what more research do we really need to fully grasp the long-term health effects of regularly eating foods like this seaweed that contain these really tiny microplastics?
That's definitely food for thought, and it certainly makes you consider the wider impacts of all this plastic on the whole food chain and maybe look a bit closer at our own choices. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.